Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Nerd Impact podcast. We're on episode 47, and we have a very special guest with us today. His name is Brion Salazar. He's from Around Comics podcast. We interviewed him regarding the subject of Daredevil Yellow, but there is lots more to talk about within that episode and that interview. He's a very knowledgeable guy. He's an absolute, humble guy. Some very interesting stories regarding meeting Stan Lee and just the comic book industry. So yeah, if you sit and listen to this interview, you'll hear more about Daredevil Yellow, but as well Daredevil and the comics kind of sphere in itself. So yeah, sit back and enjoy. Right, thank you so much, Brian, for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on here. So yeah, first thing is obviously, Brian, you are from a podcast yourself called Around the Comics, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm from Chicago. We started a podcast about 17 years ago, something like that. In a
Wow.
Yeah, we were one of the early adopters to podcasting. There was I don't know if you're familiar with the podcast Comic Book Geek Speak, but
Yes.
so they were kind of one of the early ones, and a friend of mine listened to their show, and I was sort of like, well, we could do that, and we did, and we were doing it for about 7 or 8 years in a comic book store in Chicago, and then we kind of fell off from it for a while, and with COVID, we came back,
Those
and we're back to kind of doing it weekly. So yeah, it's been fun.
Incredible. I
those
mean, first things first, then, how did that all come together? Like, what made you think, yeah, let's do a podcast, especially before the kind of podcast boom happened?
It was kind of an interesting story. So I grew up in Chicagoland. There was always a lot of talk radio. In the
mm,
80s, 70s, and 80s, especially, there was a lot of like very popular talk radio guys. So I listened to a lot of talk radio, and I was always into that. And so when podcasts came along, uh, had been a comic book fan since I was a kid. I worked with my co-host Chris at the time in 2000, whatever it was, 4, 3, something like that. And he was listening to another comic book podcast, one of the first. There were a couple. John Suntress does Word Balloon. He's from Chicagoland and also a radio guy. And then there was Comic Book Geek Speak. Those were kind of the big two that I was familiar with in the very beginning. And
mhm.
Chris listened to them, and there was a comic book convention in Chicago called Wizard World, which kind of doesn't exist any longer. But I went to that show for a few years, and I had kind of gotten to know some people in the industry. Um, and at that time, when you would go to a comic book show, if you went to the hotel bar afterwards, you would run into everybody that was at the show, so you could get to kind of know comic book creators and that kind of thing. And I was a pretty friendly guy, and outspoken, pretty gregarious
Mhm.
personality, so I got to know some people. Well, Chris wanted to do interviews for Comic Book Geek Speak, so he came to the show, and I sort of introduced him some people that I had gotten to know, and he did some interviews, and I'm like, hey, you're pretty good at that. And I just thought, well, I have a technical background. I was into computers. I was a web designer, a graphic designer. I'm like, we could probably do a podcast. So we just started doing that. And he was friends with a guy that owned a comic book shop, Dark Tower Comics, on on Western Avenue in Chicago. So we started doing it out of the comic book store every Friday night. We would just host a comic book podcast. We didn't know what we were doing. We had no idea, but it was fun. It was relatively cheap, and nobody could stop us. So we decided to just keep doing it. And it was an interesting thing. There was a lot of comic book creators that lived in Chicagoland and in the city, and they started showing up. Guys like Mike Norton and Tim Seeley and Scotty Young and a lot of different comic book creators just would pop up on Friday night. They were listening to the show, and they found out we were at Dark Tower Comics, and they would just come and they would sit in, or sometimes they would just hang out. And we got to know a lot of these guys, and it was sort of this fun thing of having them on the show, and then other creators, because there were so few comic book podcasts at the time. Creators were very interested in coming on the show and promoting their books and that kind of thing. And we were really interested in talking to some of the more underground or just the comic book creators that were just starting out and sort of promoting their work because we felt like we couldn't really do much to move the needle for Spider-Man or Batman, but
Yeah.
Mm.
an Image comic that came out and nobody knew of or people didn't read, if we promoted that, and we got an extra couple hundred sales or something out of it for a comic book creator, that could really change, the direction. And we were really fortunate early on to get a lot of great creators on the show. Since we've come back, like I said, we kind of fell off after about 7 or 8 years of doing it. It becomes a grind, when you're doing
Mm,
a weekly podcast and you're really trying to promote it and get interviews and read all the books. And we felt a responsibility to try and do a really good show, and we had a lot of fun, but it got to be a little bit of a grind, so we kind of fell off after a while. And then, like I said, with COVID, we just had the idea to come back, and we did. And now it's a completely different space. I mean, there's so many comic book podcasts now. It's kind of
mm.
ridiculous, and we were sort of forgotten about. We had our 15 minutes of fame, and then now we're just one of hundreds of comic book podcasts now. But we're having fun doing it for ourselves, and it's still a good time.
I think that's definitely, of course, you are right that we are, I suppose, being self-aware about it, is we are sort of part of that sort of post Joe Rogan, I guess, podcast boom almost. But yeah, I think that's a great attitude, sort of taking it sort of for the own enjoyment of it all, rather than that sort of becoming that. I mean, doing it for 7 or 8 years is super impressive. That's awesome that you managed to sort of stay committed to it for that long. But I suppose it being a comic book podcast, I think we should really go to the beginning, I guess. You mentioned that you've been sort of a comic book fan since you were a child. Well, where did sort of comic books begin for you?
Probably when I was about 10, 9 or 10 years old. There was two little stores by me, neither of them comic book stores. One was a 7-Eleven,
Hmm.
and one was just another little convenience store, and they both had tiny little spinner racks. And I believe the first comic I ever picked up was Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew when I was
Oh.
9 or 10 years old, and that was pretty much it. Once I was always a bit of an artist. I like to draw. Even since I was little, I always had a little bit of an affinity to draw, and I was creative. So comic books, just the visual medium of it just attracted me right away. And I was a big reader as well, so it just sort of fit right into what I liked even early on. And then I just stuck with it. There was a period of time, maybe in my late teens, early 20s, where I started to feel like and this was 1989, 1990. I started to feel like, maybe I'm too old to read comics. Maybe I shouldn't be into this hobby anymore. It's kind of weird. It's for kids, that kind of thing. And I went away from it a little bit, but then, like the Image revolution and those guys, Rob Liefeld and all those creators kind of got me back into comics in the 90s then, and I've been reading them ever since. And I just now it's mainstream. I mean, it's cool to like comics, right? It
Hmm.
wasn't always the case. When I was 12, 13, 14 years old, it was kind of a dirty little secret, and
Yeah.
something you didn't advertise to your friends that didn't read comics.
Of course, yeah.
Honestly, I think that's only because of, let's face it, the MCU. Like, I was reading comics in high school, and that was just before Iron Man came out. And then all of a sudden, when Iron Man came out, and obviously the kind of follow-on films, everyone was kind of like, yeah, yeah, I read this, I'm into this, it's really
Yeah.
cool. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. But I mean, obviously, it's just opened up that kind of gateway for you to be like, well, yeah, I do read comics. It's that's okay now. So I suppose there's a saving grace in all that. That admitting to reading comics no longer is like a taboo, which I think is kind of nice.
Yeah, there's no stigma any longer. Now it's like famous actors and actresses, supposedly read comics all the time. I mean, I'm sure some of them really do, but it's such a Hollywood thing now that
Yeah,
it's
Mm.
almost like if you don't read comics, you're not gonna have a fan base. The
yeah.
geeks have taken over finally.
Finally, just
Yeah.
about. So kind of speaking about comics and so forth. Obviously, we'll move on to the topic of the day. But where did your interest in Daredevil start?
Oh, geez. I would say, Frank Miller's run, I think was, probably around that time. I was reading Daredevil a little before that. He was, he was one of those characters that I liked because he was a little different.
Mm,
The fact that he was blind, the fact that he didn't, he had powers, but it was sort of just to compensate for, his not being able to see. And once Frank Miller sort of reinvented that character a bit, and brought in sort of the hand and the whole sort of ninja training and that mythos to the character. I really got involved in it, but I was always sort of a fan. He was kind of a Batman wannabe to some degree,
mm,
a little bit of Spider-Man to some degree, and I think um, reading Spider-Man, that's where I kind of picked up on Daredevil initially. He would once in a while have crossovers, that kind of thing. And then I really got into the character, yeah, after Frank Miller's run was something that I've been reading Daredevil ever since then, really.
Mhm.
no, yeah, Frank Miller's stuff is absolutely incredible. For me, actually, I've just remembered it was the Spider-Man cartoon that got me into Daredevil. So again, you
Oh,
talk about crossovers, but yeah, the animated series from the 90s, um, they obviously had that episode of Daredevil in it, and that was kind of what piqued my interest there, and that's when I started looking at kind of comics regarding Daredevil. And funnily enough, Daredevil Yellow was one of the first comics I ended up purchasing myself.
that's interesting. I mean, and like you said, we'll talk about Daredevil Yellow, but it's almost like a throwback to a time before Frank Miller. It's really this more innocent era of that character before he became sort of this tortured, Catholic guilt-ridden, character that we kind of know him today. Before that, I mean, he was fighting Stiltman and
Yeah.
Gladiator, and these he had, the Owl. He didn't have the greatest rogues gallery of character, villains.
Mhm.
And he was a little more lighthearted of a character, I think. Which is interesting. The change that they made to the character made him much more popular, but there was this innocence, I think, a little bit, that I think this book really kind of harkens back to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, it was the first one I read, but it's obviously it's not my favorite. It's still a good book, but like you said, I think the darker tone and the more Frank Miller esque stories are where Daredevil stories for me kind of hit home, and I resonate with them more. I enjoy them more. But this was a good read. It's quite a it's quite a simple read. It's obviously only 6 issues, but yeah. Apart from that, so we've kind of covered the appeal. What is your favorite run on Daredevil? Would it be the Frank Miller stuff, or is there any particular one that you?
Um, well, I mean, a personal favorite. I really like Ed Brubaker's run. I Interestingly enough, I had kind of got to know Ed a little bit right before it was announced that he was going to take on Daredevil, and it was sort of an exciting time, and I'm actually in that run. Strangely enough, he wrote me in as a
Amazing.
character. So there's a yeah, I have it's a very brief. It's when Matt Murdock's in prison, and
Mhm.
there's a brief scene where he talks to a one of the guards, and I'm one of the guards is named Co Salazar, and it was actually me. So or he wrote me in, but yeah, so that was kind of a neat thing. But I really like Brubaker's work with the character. I think, it's a hard thing when you have someone like Frank Miller that just completely redefines a character. Anytime you're moving forward with that, trying to find a new voice or a new perspective on a character, I think it's really difficult. And I think Ed and Michael Art did that, with that character, with their run. So I really like the Brubaker run. The Frank Miller run obviously is iconic.
Mm.
Like I said, it redefined that character. It I mean, it influenced so much. People don't talk about it, I think, as much as like they talk about the Dark Knight Returns, obviously, for Frank
Mhm.
Miller. But Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would not exist
Yeah.
if not for the Daredevil, Frank Miller's Daredevil run. That comic and cartoon and movies and everything that spawned out of that was so much, a reflection of Daredevil, Frank Miller's Daredevil, and obviously Lone Wolf and Cub and other, influences. But certainly there's things they drew from Frank Miller's Daredevil specifically. And I think a lot of other things that have kind of grown out of that people don't necessarily relate or think of when they're talking about Frank Miller's iconic work. That th- that complete run and just the way that he um, changed the character fundamentally, I think, is such a thing we take for granted now. It's like Daredevil is the man without fear,
Mm.
and he's always this tortured character. Now, anytime someone writes Daredevil, he's a very tortured soul, and he it's this thing between his sense of justice, his need for the law, but also his religious, upbringing, and that is such an essential parts of that character now, and that really wasn't the case before Frank did that to Matt Murdock. But you can't even think about the character. I mean, you look at the TV show, or maybe Charlie Cox is coming back someplace in the MCU for Daredevil. And it's just such inherently now part of that character.
It's funny you
Yeah, hundred
mentioned
percent. Yeah,
sort of
go on.
Charlie Cox in the MCU. How did you feel like I suppose the sort of future of that character within the MCU is Aiden and I have discussed it several times. Is that we're both we've discussed the Daredevil series, the Netflix series at length, and we both huge fans of it. However, we both sort of share a somewhat hesitance to sort of see how that character will undergo some sort of transition as it sort of has to sort of fit in with the wider themes of the MCU. Do you feel like
Yeah.
Daredevil will work in that space, or do you feel like he's some of the darker themes that they've sort of pushed with the Netflix series will not necessarily intertwine very well within the wider MCU?
Well, I think much like a character like Moon Knight, who the series is
Mm,
coming out, I think it would work much better in a TV show as opposed to the films.
of course.
And I think you see that it's interesting. You see it in like the Avengers movies. The difference between Captain America in the Avengers and Captain America in his own films are pretty stark. I mean, in an Avengers movies, it's almost like they have to figure out a way to use this guy that really doesn't have any powers when you're
Mm,
surrounded by a bunch of gods essentially. Um, and it's hard to do. They do it much better in the film where he's on his own because they can kind of level all the other characters down. But you even see it in like today in the comics. You have the crossover event Devil's Reign that's going on, which is a devil or Daredevil centric crossover. And the first thing they sort of do is take out a lot of the really high powered characters because you just can't have this guy that essentially is a martial artist with a little bit of heightened senses running around realistically against super super high level powered characters. So I think that's the big challenge to me of him trying to fit into the MCU. Even a character like Spider-Man, who is much more powerful essentially, or at least has the ability to be more flexible in that space than Daredevil does. So I don't know. I'm not sure how he fits into, maybe movies. I don't know if he's a character that's popular enough for his own film franchise, although Black Widow seemed to work really well. And, I mean, Black Panther isn't necessarily a very powerful character, and that movie was incredibly well received. So I think anything can be done, certainly. But I think he fits into a series more so where you can kind of take him out of, leave him in Hell's Kitchen, take him out of the greater MCU where he's going to run into a character like Loki or the Hulk or, whatever. Thanos. What is Daredevil going to do against Thanos or, those kind of characters? It's not going to, it's not going to really play that well, I don't think.
that does make perfect sense. I suppose. I guess also like the theme wise, because what I was sort of getting at, I suppose, is that we have Moon Knight coming out, which is supposedly meant to be a bit more of a darker take, slightly more gritty
Mhm.
and violent. And with Frank Miller's run being as influential as it was on the Daredevil series, season 3 sort of really pushed that whole sort of the Catholic guilt and the torture of
Yeah.
Matt Murdock. Also comes with a dose of violence. And do you feel like that level of violence from sort of a remnant, I suppose, of Frank Miller's run is essential to the character, and that sort of, well, I guess, neutering him in a way would take something away from the character?
I think that's a good point. I think it is actually. I think to some degree Matt is a character that has an anger inside of him.
Mm.
He has this sense of justice that he can't get from the law. Being a lawyer, it's frustrating for him, I think, because he can't get, so he goes out in a costume and he beats up bad guys because he has this other sense of right and wrong that drives him. So I think that conflict ends up in violence. And if you take that out, I suppose there's some way to figure that out. I don't know, what you're going to deal with at that point. It may be a bit dry. It may be, something that comic book fans aren't really looking for necessarily,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think the violence is certainly part of him. I think you can play it in a way though where you question it. It's like I think Matt Murdock is a character that's interesting because he's not always right. He doesn't always make the best decisions. He
Mhm.
sometimes his temper gets the best of him. Sometimes he doesn't always do the right thing. He's trying to do the right thing, but he's not perfect. He's a flawed character, and I think that's kind of what makes him interesting to me, as opposed to a lot of other characters. I think you have a character like Spider-Man is the same sort of thing. It's different in a lot of ways. It's not. Well, it's the difference between someone who's supposed to be a teenager and someone who's an adult, I
Mhm.
Mm.
think, but they both make mistakes. They're not perfect people. They're just trying to do the best they can. So I think, it's all about the writing. It's all about, who's attached to it and who does it. And I think you can do anything with any character at some point.
Mm.
It's just how well it's written and the perspective you're trying to take with it.
Brilliant answer.
Yeah, 100% agree there. I think also the only obviously pitfall with the lack of violence, if they go down that route, is people who are accustomed to the Netflix seasons 1 to 3 are going to be a little bit confused. It might be a bit jarring to have someone who, like Wilson Fisk smashing someone's head in with a car door. For
Right.
him, like he was in Hawkeye, where they had to completely water down how violent he was, and he just threw someone into a building, which is still pretty, like I'd say action packed, but the violence isn't there. And I know a lot of people already have had notes and complaints, or are looking at how they've already handled Wilson Fisk. Are they going to do the same with Daredevil? Are they going to see how Moon Knight goes and see if they can continue with that slightly darker, grittier series? I'm not too sure, but I think hopefully they'll listen to the fans, and with this whole move to Disney Plus with parental locks and all that, as we've said, Nath, off podcast, I think they're testing it personally. I think they're going to test how well the Defenders kind of series work does, Daredevil, and see if they can bring in the violence, or if they need to water it down and have it more accessible to a wider audience. But I'm optimistic,
I
cautiously optimistic.
It's interesting if you look at like a series sort of like The Mandalorian. I mean, there's a ton
Mm.
of violence in that, or even the Star Wars films, that kind of thing. It's just a different, like you said, it's the way it's sort of shown. Is it a visceral, bloody kind of thing, or is it a little less gory, violence where you're shooting a stormtrooper? It's so what? Who
Yeah,
cares? There's a million of those guys, or
yeah.
you're cutting the heads off of robots with a lightsaber. It doesn't really matter. It's still violence. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Disney, especially when you look at if you look at sort of the distinguished competition as they used to be known, DC, HBO Max, and their series,
Yeah.
stuff like Peacekeeper, which is incredibly violent to the point of ridiculousness, um, and stuff like that, or the new Batman film that just came out, which is very dark. It just keeps getting darker. At some point, we're just going to have a black screen because everything is so dark and gritty, and but yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they go with characters like that. I think with Daredevil, it doesn't necessarily have to be violent in that sense. I think there's a
Mm.
certain amount you're going to have to show, but I think you could lean more, and I wouldn't be surprised with Moon Knight if they do this, is the psychological drama, that
Mm.
are inherent in those characters. Moon Knight's a very interesting character, I think, in that sense, for the MCU, because there's a lot about him that he's a tortured character as well, depending on how they play it, whether it's the multiple personality disorder or his dealing with PTSD from the war. I'm not sure how they're portraying this version of Moon Knight, but there's a lot you can kind of play with that makes it much more of a drama that isn't necessarily all violence driven.
Hmm.
Even a character, I mean, you look at the Punisher series, which I thought
Wicked.
was excellent.
Mm.
That dealt with his violence, but also like his dealing with the repercussions of that, of being a violent person, of coming from a violent world, from coming from war, having sort of a psychological scar from all of that kind of thing, and constantly dealing with it. So I think there's ways that you can certainly make him an interesting character in the MCU, without it just resorting to blood and guts and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a really good take on it. Again, I think we just need to be optimistic and see what they bring to the plate if a series even happens down the line.
Yeah.
So yeah, regarding Daredevil Yellow, obviously you were more than happy to come onto this episode. So, what is your kind of thoughts around Daredevil Yellow, really?
I'm a big well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Tim Sale as an artist, first and foremost, and I really like pretty much everything that he's done in collaboration. With I'm blanking on the writer. Gosh,
Jeph Loeb.
Jeph Loeb. Yes, I've liked everything that they've done, both at Marvel and DC over the years. I was a
Yeah.
fan of Tim Sale before he was a comic book artist. He was doing covers for books, book series that I read when I was younger called Mything Adventures. It was a Robert Aspirin. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote. It was a series of books about a kid who was like an apprentice for a wizard, and wasn't very good at it. Didn't really even like it so much. And the wizard tried to summon a demon, and the wizard died, and then the demon ended up being a demon, but it was sort of a different take on it. He was a dimensional traveler, and he ended up taking this kid on all these crazy adventures, and it was like Mything Adventures and Myth Inc. It was all the books started with myth, and a play on words, and he was actually a cover artist for them early on, and actually had done I think the first thing I saw of his was a graphic novel based on those books that he had done back in, I want to say, the 90s. So I'm a huge fan of his work. So that is the easy sell for me. And then I'm a big Daredevil fan. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book when I first read it. I enjoyed it even more so, I think, now that I read it kind of years later, just with a new perspective on it. And what I like about it is because it really does harken back to this time before Frank Miller's run.
Mm.
And it's a bit of a love letter to
Mm.
that era, and especially to Karen Page,
Yes.
um, which is a character that, Frank didn't do nice things to. Frank used Karen, and turned her life into a she, the sort of trope of using a female character as simply as a way to advance, the main male character story, that kind of thing. That was what Karen turned into for Frank. And good or bad, however you want to look at it, at the time, I don't think anyone thought that much about it, but um Jeff Loeb going back to sort of a time frame before that, and I felt like this was almost like, let's give Karen a let's give her due.
Mm.
Sort of a love letter to that character and to that era. And it was fun for me to read it. It was this, a more innocent time of Daredevil, to some degree. He's still Daredevil. He's still dealing with his own demons to some degree, but there's not that real darkness yet, to the character, to his life. Like, it's fun. It's lighthearted. Even the sort of dramatic parts of, whether he's fighting bad guys, it's much more silly, and almost like this adventure, as opposed to this very dark thing. And even the moments, with Foggy, sort of falling in love with Karen, and there's that sort of heartbreaking scene where he's gonna have, he has a ring, and then he sees that Karen and Matt are kind of falling in love, and even that's played in a way where it's not. I mean, it's sad to some degree, but it's not as tragic as maybe you could turn it into if you really wanted to.
Mm.
And so I really enjoyed it from that perspective. Artistically, I think it was great. I One of the scenes that I loved, and it's not much of a scene, but it's in the first issue, I think, where the Fantastic Four show up outside of Matt's. I just absolutely loved that scene because that too, sort of just harkened back to a time at Marvel where that universe was so fresh and fun, and anything could happen when these characters all lived in New York, and it just felt like a real, I don't know, there was a sense of innocence that doesn't necessarily exist in Marvel or DC Comics anymore.
Mm.
That stuff isn't there. Good or bad. I mean, I come from a time where when I got into comics in the 80s, it still was there. Certainly in DC more maybe than Marvel. Marvel, always had a little bit more of an edge, but going through the mid 80s and then into the 90s extreme era of comics where everything just got dark. Every character is extreme and violent and dark and gritty and bloody, and we're dealing with much more mature uh you know issues and story ideas. It's fun for me to kind of in a nostalgic way go back to that time. I'm a sucker for anything nostalgic in comics. Darwin Cook's The New Frontier is one of my absolute favorite books of all time. But it's this nostalgia of the silver age of comics, which was nothing but silliness and fun, and there was never any, you know, uh, dark issues that were dealt with at that time. And I understand that, I enjoy modern comics. I enjoy mature themes and that kind of thing in comics as well. But every once in a while, it's nice to kind of I don't need I don't need like some tense dramatic dark twisted thing psychodrama in every. Sometimes it's fun to just have a little bit more innocence in comics.
It's a good little
Yeah, I
palate
100%
cleanser.
agree.
And
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, as I said, this was the first Daredevil comic I read, so there was the light-hearted goofiness to it, and then obviously I kind of researched and found obviously the Frank Miller stuff, which is polar opposite. So going back and reading this after so many years was actually really refreshing. Especially again, like you said, quite nostalgic, but it was also nice just to have obviously after jumping on the series, reading the Frank Miller kind of novels and stuff. There's a lot of brutal, dark Daredevil, and then you kind of had this, and like you said, it was quite fresh. It was still not. It's still good. It still had like its darkish moments, but
Hmm.
obviously the focus around him and Karen was really sweet. And again, I saw kind of influences on the TV series that took from kind of this and Frank Miller. Instead of like you said, making Karen an addict and basically just using her as bait for Matt to kind of move forward as a character. They kind of use this where she starts off as the damsel in distress, quote unquote, but then is finds her feet and is a strong character, and
Hmm.
her relationship with Matt in this harkens to the first series, whether it's like goofy flirting and they're not too sure they're into each other, and then they realize maybe
Right.
there's more to it. Same with Foggy and how he, in the series he has a crush on her, and in this he's going to propose. I was saying actually off screen though, the one thing that I really struggle with in this is Foggy's design. After coming off watching the series and stuff, like he kind of looks like a middle-aged man, and it's really jarring to see him in these issues as this quite like big chunky kind of old looking guy who's in love with Karen Page. It's just like it doesn't feel like it would happen. But that's one flaw in this series, but the rest of it I think is beautiful. And like you said, the artwork again, we were discussing this, like with Kilgrave, the purple man, like the purple's so clean on it, and it looks like it really pops out. And when he's like leaping over things or doing the
Mm.
aerobics and stuff, like it just looks so good, and it's really fresh. And again, the yellow, which I think we'll come on to afterwards, the yellow makes it stand out. And this is again something we were talking about was what's your feelings on the yellow suit? It's quite a yeah. I don't know how people feel about it. I personally really like it. So yeah, Brian, what about you?
I've always been a fan of it. Yeah, I always liked it whenever there was a story that, you know, he would either wear that again, or they would sort of flash back to every once in a while, which wasn't that often. But as I got into Daredevil, I started collecting back issues of his stuff when he was wearing the yellow costume, and yeah, I've always been a fan of it. I don't know if I'd want to see it time necessarily. In today's it's kind of doesn't make much sense that a guy would run around in a bright yellow costume, but I think it's a cool costume. I even liked the character D-Man, which was sort of a spin, not a spin-off, a little bit of a spin-off from Daredevil, but his costume sort of was essentially the same look as this yellow. So yeah, I like it, but I don't know if it would work all the time.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like I said, it was for this issue, it worked quite well, and obviously then he gets his red suit, the famous red suit at the end of it, which I think was very cool as well. It kind of had a nice continuity to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this, Nath? Any thoughts on this?
I would say that one of the appeal for, I suppose, one of the major appeals for me for Daredevil is he is a lawyer. I have a law degree myself, so it's interesting, particularly, and as he sort of mentions within this comic, I believe it's in issue 1, is he says he has utmost faith in the law, yet he still seeks other ways to justice, and I think that's perhaps even ever so slightly hypocritical. I suppose that's maybe something that gets more explored in other comics, but I've always enjoyed that sort of double perspective of it, that Daredevil is pursuing justice in all arenas, not just law court, but also on the street. And I can't really encourage vigilante justice, but I find that admirable in sort of manifesting the order that he seeks within the law through his own sort of his own means. And I suppose, do you find that angle of it sort of enjoyable? Do you enjoy sort of lawyer Matt Murdock, I suppose?
I do, yeah. It's one of the things that always attracted me to the character was that they would, there was that conflict in him. There's
Hmm.
always this conflict of like he's this lawyer, he's this really good lawyer, and he believes in the law and he fights for the law, but he understands that it's not perfect and that there are going to be things that happen that are, outside of his control as a lawyer, so that he then goes and tries to fix those at night in in a costume, which is silly, but it is this sort of, it's what drives him. It's
Mm.
what it's a different to me purpose. He has a different purpose than a lot of other superheroes in that way, where it's like he's directly in conflict with his own beliefs, but
Hmm.
it's so powerful inside of him, whether it's because of his father, whether it's because of his Catholic upbringing, which was always, I'm not Catholic, I'm not religious at all. But that was always an interesting thing to me too, with him, is that sort of Catholic guilt and that part of the character, which I thought was very unique. Not really, I mean, I don't know of any other superheroes that really deal with their religion on a regular basis, or even
Mm.
know any what characters are religious. Um so that was always a really interesting thing, that he had that part of him, that
Hmm.
also created a certain amount of guilt, created a certain amount of angst and just doubt inside of him, whether he was doing the right thing. He dresses as a devil, yet he is a devout Catholic. He's conflicted. He's a very complex character, and I always thought that was the most interesting thing about Daredevil, especially compared to some other characters that are much more one note, sort of very simple. Like, they do this because it's the right thing to do. Superman,
Yeah.
I love Superman, but Superman, it's like, he does it because, his parents taught him right and from wrong, and that's sort of why he does what he does. Or, Batman does what he does because his parents were killed when he was a kid, and he's seeking that justice forever. Um, to me, that, over 60, 70 years of doing that, it kind of gets difficult to stay as engaged. Where
Mhm.
with Matt, it's evolving. The law is always evolving, right? You can deal with different aspects of justice and the idea of justice and what is right versus wrong. What is, you can play with that. It's a little more malleable because the law is a breathing, living, breathing thing, right? Like,
Mhm.
it changes as society changes. So that, I find that really fascinating about the character.
Most definitely. And I suppose that in internal conflict and that sort of religious aspect is pretty much completely absent in Daredevil Yellow. Like he still does good, but you still see him when he goes and fights Electro. He wasn't intending to sort of pursue the superhero aspect. It just sort of happened. Like he was going to go basically pursue. He was going to get some papers for Reed Richards, but he just ends up sort of becoming a superhero sort of almost by accident. So you don't
Right.
necessarily have that driving force, which my interpretation of the character, at least my understanding, would that be major? That Catholicism and he of course has his belief in the law, but the absence of the Catholicism, as you mentioned, is sort of pretty cool defining feature of our interpretation, sort of the wider cultural understanding of Daredevil.
Mm-hmm.
How did you feel like that sort of maybe feels quite absent within Daredevil Yellow, or do you still you can still feel that Matt Murdock's motivated?
It Yeah, it does. I mean, it's certainly. I think once again, it's why I feel like it's really just a throwback to almost like Jeph Loeb was a little upset with what Frank Miller did with the character. You know what I mean? And it's like, no, I'm going to take him back before that. I'm going to show what this character was before Frank did that. And because
Mm,
it's I- if if you were a kid and you grew up reading this character, when Gene Colan was drawing it and writing it, and he's fighting vampires and Night Stalker and Stiltman and that kind of thing, and then all of a sudden, Frank, turns his girlfriend into a drug addict, and there's this whole different thing to the character. It could really probably make you upset. You know what I mean? Not that comic book fans ever get upset when their characters are
it
changed.
absolutely never happens.
No, no. But so to me, it felt like, you know what, I'm gonna take this character back to a time before that. So
Mhm,
it doesn't surprise me that the Catholicism isn't a part of this, because I think that was certainly a Frank Miller addition to the character. I don't know. I don't think that was ever really a part of the character before Frank.
mhm.
It may have been touched on, or maybe just assumed. Growing up Irish in New York, he probably would be Catholic, but um, yeah, I think Frank was certainly uh, added that to the character. So it's this is a this book in particular is like I said, it's a nostalgic throwback. It's a fun delve into an era of Daredevil that doesn't exist any longer.
Mhm,
But like you said, I think the idea that it seems like they drew some of this stuff for the TV show, shows that, it's not just the tortured soul that's interesting. It's okay to be, like Karen Page in the show, I think, is one of the best parts of the show. I think, the fact that they made her an equal to the other characters, and it was sort of the three of them running around as this little Scooby-Doo, group, I thought was great. And I love the fact, I can't think of the actress's name off the top of my head now, but she was phenomenal and as Karen, and just really gave that character so much more,
mhm.
which I was glad we never I was glad we never saw sort of a down spiral, of her into the Karen Page of the comics, because that would have been heartbreaking. Because you
They
kind of
hinted
fall.
at it.
They
They
did.
hinted at it
They
in season
Yeah.
3, and I was like, that is enough. No more.
Yeah, yeah, you know what I mean? Because it's like you kind of fall in love with her. She's a wonderful actress, and she did a great job. And Karen's, this great character in the show. And it's like, oh God, I don't want to see that. Don't do that to me, please. Don't torture me that way. But yeah, I think part of it too is like writers. They fall into, and I think it was Brian Michael Bendis, might have been, or it might have been Brubaker. I don't remember. We had someone on the show at one point talking about Daredevil, and this sort of subject in particular. And it is
Mhm.
this thing where once a character is defined so strongly, whether it's Batman from Dark Knight Returns, whether it's Daredevil, from the Frank Miller run, once that happens, it's so hard for a writer to then come on later and sort of get away from that. You almost feel like, well, I have to kind of stick with that themes, or those sort of mythologies to the character to some degree. So I think for years afterwards, you sort of just saw people, with the idea, writers just going, well, how do we torture Matt Murdock some more? How do we, you know what I mean? Like that's all he kind of became. And I think you still see that to some degree, where writers just sort of, how do we figure out how to twist the knife in Matt and then bring him back, sort of break him down and build him back up, is a little bit of that character's chemistry now. And it'll be interesting if anyone ever kind of tries to really go away from that. I don't know. I'm not sure how you would, but I'd be interested to see it. It'd probably fail spectacularly.
I
Kind of
suppose
on the notes of Karen and so forth. So, what's your thoughts on Elektra? Because personally, I lean more towards him and Elektra's relationship, both in comics and TV series.
Uh, Elektra's such a interesting character. I mean, I am a huge fan of the Sienkiewicz Elektra assassin and what happened with that character. Then once they brought her back again, I
Mm,
wasn't necessarily that excited about seeing her. I thought, you know, she's one of those characters that they did such a great job with her, and it was such an epic storyline. Um, and her death was meaningful, and it was sort of important in the Marvel universe at the time. It was a big deal. It was a huge thing for Matt Murdock, and Daredevil and their relationship, and uh, it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know. I didn't know how I felt bringing her back. It's almost I'm almost separated from the character in the
mm,
sense where there was an Elektra then, and now there's a different Elektra. In my brain, I can't quite merge the two. You know what I
mm,
mean? It would
yeah.
almost be like if they brought Captain Marvel back, the
Mm,
original Marvel. If they, it's like I don't know that I could ever really accept that the fact that he would be back,
yeah.
and be the same character. It just, I don't know. At some point, it's I'm done with that character, and that's okay. It was done so well, but um, I don't think. Here's the thing. I don't think Daredevil. I don't think Matt Murdock is ever going to have a successful relationship. So it doesn't matter if it's Karen. It doesn't matter if it's Elektra. It doesn't I don't think that's ever going to be. You can't. At that point, then you take away so much tension and drama but in this day and age, it's a different thing because you can't use her like you once did as a
Hmm.
writer. You can't just make her this, tool to give sympathy to Matt. So yeah, now she's the woman without fear. So it's a completely different sort of thing. And that's a different type of relationship. I don't know if I'm that interested in it from a comic book fan perspective.
Yeah.
But other people might be. I'm 51 years old. So for me, there's a part of me that at some point just has to accept the fact that there are comic books being written and made today that aren't for me. And that's
mhm.
cool. Like that's great. I don't have to like everything. I shouldn't.
Yeah.
Not everything should appeal to 50-year-old comic book fan. There's plenty of comics that do. So um it should appeal to people that are younger. If you're gonna stay in business, otherwise
Yeah.
you're gonna be in trouble, Marvel.
I suppose that's a good question. Is how do you sort of feel about, I suppose, the sort of future prospects of comic books as a medium? We've seen the enormous, like, completely astronomical rise of the MCU, and of course,
Mhm.
sort of a lot, especially with Moon Knight coming out, is we're seeing a lot more interest in, I suppose, Moon Knight's maybe even like below a D tier character. We're seeing a lot of characters, as they move into sort of phase 4, a lot of characters which are lesser known, don't have the same sort of draw as say Iron Man or Thor. We're seeing a lot of Marvel properties getting really driven forward. How do you feel that the sort of comic book industry will evolve from here? Do you feel like we'll see a sort of almost recycling, or do you feel like this is a really fertile new ground for new ideas?
Uh, wow, that's a big question. um, I don't know. I think it's been an interesting thing to watch this popularity of comic book characters and properties just explode in my lifetime. It's really if you were to tell me when I was 14 years old that I was going to, have a decade of the biggest actors and the biggest budget movies of Marvel Comics characters on screen, I wouldn't believe it. And the idea that I could buy, you know, uh, any possible combination of toy, shirt, lunchbox, anything with all these characters that I loved, I wouldn't believe it. It would just be unbelievable for me. And the idea that, there are people now in the world that have never read a comic book that know more about these characters than I do, sort of blows my mind. Like I have a nephew who, has never read a comic book in his life, but absolutely loves everything that comes out of the MCU and will correct me on the history of some obscure Marvel character that I forgot existed. You know what I mean? Because he
Yeah.
watches, YouTube videos to try and, know that he wants to know the history of all these characters that are coming out. And it's an interesting thing. On the other side of it, you have the comic book industry, which I think is doing well. I think is healthy. I think is growing. It seems like sales, I'm not really that in tune with it, but it seems like sales for comics are doing well. I think that the companies Marvel and DC need to figure out a better way to translate fans, the millions and millions and millions of fans that watch the movies and TV shows, to try and transfer them into the comic book readers. Even if
Yeah.
you're only getting a certain percentage of them, it's a little sad to me that you have, the biggest movie in the world, Spider-Man No Way Home comes out and it's gigantic, enormous hit. I mean, talking about Oscar, nomination, it's breaking records at the box office. Everybody talks about it for 2-3 weeks, straight. Um, Yet the comic book is struggling to sell, what it sold in the 90s or in the 80s. You know what I mean? So it's a weird thing. I'm not sure how you do that. I don't know how the comic book companies do that necessarily because they are two completely different mediums and they are, you know, things that are just different. You're not going to turn movie fans necessarily into comic book fans, but I think that they could do a better job of it.
Yeah.
But I think some of that is sort of structurally so baked into comic books, the monthly format of comics, the idea that there's 7 different Batman books out there.
Mm.
And, so one of them has an issue number, 1070 on it, and another one is issue number 1.
Yeah.
Where do I start if I want to get into comics? So the entry into reading comics is not an easy one. The entry
Mhm.
into reading or into the movies, if I don't know anything about Batman, I can go see Batman and I don't need to know anything about Batman. But if I want to read Batman, where do I start? Where do I go? Where do I even begin to try and get into this hobby? So I think that's a bigger thing than like, what do we make the books? You're always going to make good comic books. There's people that are very passionate about making good comics, but it's like, as an industry, how do we sort of change things so that it's easier for people to turn into comic book readers if they're in love with, I mean, Harry Potter did it, right? Like people will read books. Why won't they read comics? Why won't millions of kids read Spider-Man comics if they're going to see these movies? Like there's got to be a way to translate. And I think a small percentage of them are,
Mhm.
but comparatively, like there's probably more people that dress up as Spider-Man on a
Mm.
weekly basis than read Spider-Man. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? There's more cosplayers than there are comic book fans, which is one of the reasons I stopped going to comic book conventions. But it's just like, so how, I think that's something that concerns me a little bit with the industry as far as like, I think they could be doing a better job of converting, the mainstream fans that now exist, that love these characters, that have realized the value of these characters, why they've been around for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. There's so many stories you can tell with these characters and that can relate to all different, generationally. You can
Hmm.
relate to a 10-year-old. I mean, Spider-Man No Way Home can relate to the youngest kid and a 60-year-old, 70-year-old, adult. Like, so there's got to be a way to sort of do that better to get more people to read comics so that the industry is healthier or remains
Yeah.
healthy, because
Yeah.
and I think the other thing is right now in Marvel and DC you don't have, because of the way things are sort of have been designed for so long, uh you don't have creators giving you their best ideas any longer. I
Okay.
feel. I think a lot of comic book creators now um want to create their own
Mm.
characters and their own franchises and have their own movie. Miller, who started at Marvel and made some huge books for them, but then quickly started creating his own characters that he make his own movies and deals and that kind of stuff with. And I think you're seeing more and more of that from comic book creators, where it's like, well, I'm not gonna create a character for Marvel that they're gonna go and make $1 billion worth. If I have a great idea for a character, I'm just going to use Marvel to build my fan base up. And then I'm going to take that over to Image or Independent or Kickstarter or wherever. And then I'm going to try and sell that to Hollywood myself. I think that's something you see a lot. So that's a little concerning if you look at it, because at one time, all these characters got made because you had brilliant artists and writers who weren't making any, this was where they were putting all their great ideas. They were putting them in Marvel and DC and that kind of thing. um but that's not happening. When was the last time there was like a really breakout new character from Marvel or DC that wasn't just
Mm.
a new take on an old character? You know what I mean? It's been a while. I don't even know. I can't even think of a
Yeah.
character that isn't just and so you're going to see that sort of thing. And maybe that's, I don't know that Hollywood wants anything more than that. I mean,
Hmm.
Disney didn't spend all that money on Marvel because they want new ideas. It's like, no, we can mine these ideas forever. And it's sort of an interesting thing because comics are kind of built to be mantles. Like, it's okay. At some point, somebody else is going to play Captain America. At some point, somebody else is going to play Captain Marvel. Somebody else is going to play Spider-Man. Someone else is going to play Batman. And now you're in this place where people accept that. Where it's like,
Hmm.
oh, Robert Patterson's Batman now? Fine. I'm going to go, I started with, you know, Adam West. It was, Batman at one point, and and 4 versions of Batman, 5 or whatever, however many it is, and it's fine. I accept that, and I think now mainstream moviegoers accept that too. It's like, oh, this is just sort of the way it works.
Yeah.
Um, so I think they have a lot of money to make before they get to a point where they run out of those uh, twists that they can do.
Yeah.
I feel like
Absolutely.
I'm talking a lot,
No,
fellas. You
no,
guys
no,
No,
no.
no,
It's fine.
honestly, that is an amazing answer because you addressed all like the separation between character and comic, and that sort of, I guess, decentralization of the comic book industry. Do you feel like, as you said, the people creators aren't really taking their best ideas to Marvel because they want those rights and they can see the earning potential there? Do you feel like that leads to more creativity, or do you feel like the absence of a great number of minds collected in one place, really working towards making Marvel the amazing place that it was? Well, I wouldn't say amazing, but amazing ideas rather than actually a workplace. But did you feel like that leads to more creativity, or do you feel like you're seeing like almost a brain drain, I suppose?
I think there's pros and cons to it. I think that on one hand, um, I think artists need editors
Mm,
to some degree. You'll always kind of get those auteurs, those really gifted people that are able to do it themselves and don't need that.
yeah.
But I'm a big fan of collaboration. I think comic books are inherently a collaborative effort. And to create something like the Marvel universe, like that didn't happen. I mean, as much as Stan likes to try and or did try and take all the credit for everything. It didn't happen without a bunch of different creative people working together,
Mm.
almost by
Yeah.
accident. You know what I mean? The MCU accidentally put together in that way and became this thing, but it was because you had all these people pushing in the same direction.
Hmm.
Um, so I think there's some, deficiencies when you don't have that, when you have a bunch of creative people that are doing their own things. But at the same time, you also have this ability to kind of go off in a lot of different directions,
Yeah.
which is good as well. And I think, today I would argue there are more good comic books coming out today than ever before. As far
Hmm.
as quantity and quality, I don't know that there has ever been, more a larger range of comics, of style of comic books, whatever type of story you want to read, there's probably 10, decent, if not really good comics of that style.
Yeah.
There's so many more artists and writers involved, so many people in the industry creating all sorts of things. So yeah, I think I guess it just depends on what you want. Do you want sort of a
Hmm.
shared universe? Do you want another Marvel? But I don't know, and I won't be around to see it, but I don't know if 60 years from now you're going to have um, any of these characters coming out independently that are going to
Hmm.
still be around. You know what I mean? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll exist. Are you going to have, a new MCU, a new DC universe, a new sort of, I don't, the boys would be the closest thing I, can
Hmm.
think of that is an independent book that's become hugely successful. But is that group of characters going to be around 60 years from now?
No.
I doubt it, right? I probably not. Are we still going to be telling Avenger stories or Hulk stories or Batman stories, Superman stories 50 years from now? Maybe. I mean, probably to some degree. I don't know. So that as much as all the I think there's great comics coming out and I enjoy stuff on a weekly basis. I don't know if you're going to see a longevity to anything that I've seen in the last 10, 15, even more years. I can't really point to anything that I would say, "Oh, that'll be around 50 years from now." Somebody will be
Yeah.
telling a story about that character. It's an interesting thing. You look at and obviously I'm talking about American comics. You guys have a whole different world of comic books that we're not even talking about. But you know uh for whatever reason, these characters, these guys and girls in brightly colored costumes running around punching people, for whatever reason they've been around for all this time. And it's a really unique thing because they were kind of created by a bunch of people that really didn't care about them necessarily like we do.
Yeah.
You
Mm.
know what I mean? They were just doing a job. Jack
Mm.
Kirby was, just doing a job, and they were just trying to publish comics. They were just trying to put stuff out. And almost by accident, they tapped into something fundamentally human. They created a mythology, like a modern mythology in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then, the fact that now it's this gigantic machine of pop culture
Mm.
is amazing. It's just unbelievable that all these years later, these characters are more popular than ever before.
Absolutely.
It's worldwide, like it's unreal. So I don't know. As much as I love, I don't understand it necessarily.
Mm.
Why it's so popular?
I
Yeah.
must say, I've got to go back to something you said about how we can try and make comics more accessible for moviegoers. I must say, I've got to give credit to some of the local comic book shops near me. Um, and it's to be fair, it's a formula that they could probably do within theaters or when promoting these movies. But when there's a big MCU or DC film or even stuff like The Boys coming out, comic book shops will either try and find the issues or have the graphic novel collections of
Hmm.
what those films are based off. So for the life of me, like let's say the new Batman film, I've seen shops promoting Year One, The Long Halloween, The Man Who Laughs, like all these kind of big popular storylines and putting them at the front of their shop and being like, look, this film that you're really excited about, that you love, what you know, this is what it's actually based off. This is what the writers of this
Yeah.
film have put on record that was their foundations. Read it. And that's how I fell into a few comic books, especially with Daredevil. After the series came out, I kind of went and looked at what they were based off. Born Again. I read that before season 3, but straight away I went back and reread it because of looking at what that was based off, the foundation. So I think if they want people to get into comics, I think they need to do something as simple as just starting by introducing what these films, TV shows were based off, what storylines they took plot points from. If they enjoyed that bit, go and read the whole story of what it was based off. I mean, The Dark Knight was off The Long Halloween, which is why I ended up going and buying The Long Halloween. And, really enough, that's by Jeph Loeb and Tim
Yeah.
Sale. It's an incredible story. It's one of the best.
Yeah.
And,
Agreed.
so I think that might be the only way at the moment to get movie lovers into comics is by looking at where it all came from, what it was, the foundation was built off. So yeah, that's just my one take. I just thought it was a really good way of how my comic book shops were trying to promote things and get new people involved.
Mm.
No, I agree with you. I think comic book shops probably do a better job of it than the industry as a
Yeah,
whole. I mean, and sometimes it's difficult. You look at something like Batman, and you have this movie that comes out, and people are super excited and love it, and then you know, but you look at a character like the Riddler, and it's like, okay, well now I'm going to go to a comic book store and wait, with this guy running around bowler hat and a and a green suit. It's like there's a disconnect there, and so sometimes
mm,
there's not a whole lot they can do about it, because I don't know how much Hollywood and the comic book publishing part of it talk. I mean, I think they should more. You would think that there would be a more sort of conversation back and forth of like, okay, this is what's happening. This movie's coming out next year. What can we do? What can we publish in the next? How do we sort of drive towards that idea? But on the other hand of it, like I was thinking, look at manga. Manga does a great job because if you walk into a comic book store and you want to start on a series, there's like, okay, here's 25 volumes, or here's 50 volumes, or 100 volumes. Here's number one,
yeah,
and this is where you
Mhm.
start. And you can just, like Reacher, the new Amazon. I don't know if either of you have watched the
yeah,
new Amazon. Um, Really good show, and I never read a Reacher book before. I'm like, "Oh, I'm gonna go check it out." Well, I know exactly where to start in that series because there's the first book in the series, and there's 22 volumes after that, or how volumes. So it's really easy for me to just go to that medium and now start enjoying this character in a different medium. In
Mm.
comics, okay, that Batman movie with Robert Pattinson, I loved it. I go to a comic book store. Well, now it's on the comic book store. Do they have it in stock? Can they get it? And then what do we have? What do I carry? There's 70 years of Batman, and there's, 300 trades, hardcovers. Nothing is the definitive start to any of it. I mean, unless you go back to 1939 and you want to
Mm.
yeah,
go, but nobody wants to read Golden Age you know what I mean? Like nobody today, no 22-year-old is going to want to go and read a Golden Age comic of Batman unless they're just really odd. But, but the majority of people are not going to do that. So it's like, where do you, as a comic shop owner, it's really difficult then to sort of go, well, what am I going to carry? Is this going to sell? Because I assume comic shops where you guys are much like they are here. They're running on very thin margins. They're not. They don't have enough volume to sort of take a bunch of chances with stuff.
yeah,
They have to sort of rely on their monthly customers that come back, and so that's a tough thing. That it's not easy, and the industry isn't making it easier. You know what I mean? It's not like the industry goes, "Hey, you know what? Batman's coming out next year. Let's package some stories together and get it published so that comic book stores." I mean, that's what I would be doing if I
mm,
was, if I ran Marvel or I ran DC Comics. I'd be like, "Okay, next year Batman's coming out. Let's First of all, let's line up some stuff that comes out the week that that movie's hitting, the 2 weeks leading up to it, the 3 weeks after it. Let's make sure we have some things published that are coming out right then and there, whether it's back issue stuff that we're going to recollect that has to do with the Riddler, has to do with Batman's origin. Let's make sure we get this into the hands of comic book stores or wherever so that people, if they want to buy comics that are based on the movie, can.
Hmm.
But I don't
Totally
know that
agree.
I don't think it's happening. You know what I
No.
mean? And that's to me, that's just, I come from a marketing background. It's like, why are you not doing this? Why are you not taking advantage of this multi-billion dollar advertising commercial? You have a $300 million commercial that is hitting screens all over the world. Why are you not taking advantage of that, DC Comics?
Hmm.
If you're the publisher, Jim Lee or whoever it is that's making these decisions, why are you not taking advantage of this gigantic advertising, massive? You couldn't ask for more advertising
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
something that you already have. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
I don't know. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
No. Yeah. You're right. Before we wrap up, I've got to say, because of your extensive comic book knowledge, which you have shown with us today, which we are entirely grateful for, are there any comic book recommendations that you would give to the audience? And it doesn't have to
Oh,
just be Daredevil,
Mhm.
top five or whatever you see best. Like, what would you tell people
whew.
to read right now?
Stuff that's coming out right now. Let's see. What am I enjoying? Anything Jeff Lemire does. I'm a big fan of his whole Black Hammer universe.
Mhm.
If you're into sort of a new superhero universe, that basically it very much harkens back to nostalgic stuff, but it's also very modern. It's kind of like uh a retelling of the Justice League to some degree. So I really like anything Jeff Lemire does. Um, what else? I'll tell you what. There's some smaller publishers that are putting out stuff. But there's a writer, a guy by the name of Mark Russell, who I think is the best. He does the best satire in comics right now, and which is not a lot of people are doing a lot of satire.
Mm,
Mhm.
I think he does some fantastic stuff. So for DC, he's currently doing One Star Squadron, which is just a hilarious book and just wickedly, full of kind of inside jokes and kind of poking fun at the comic book industry and superheroes to some degree. But he also does a book called My Bad, which is from Ahoy Comics. But he's a guy that pretty much anything he does right now, I'll pick up.
okay,
Uh,
amazing.
yeah, he's really good. Yeah, I mean, I'm much more of at this point, like I kind of follow creators more than I do individual titles. Um, the new Moon Knight though is I that's a book I really enjoy right now. The new She-Hulk that just came out, there's only 2 issues. I think it's really good.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's lots of stuff. To me, anytime anybody asks me, hey, what kind of comics should I pick up or that kind of thing? It's like, well, what do you like? What kind of stories do you like? Because I can kind of point you in any direction, because I think there's stuff that it exists in every genre. That's the beautiful thing about comics is,
Mm,
depending on what you like, if you like in comics, if you like manga, if you like, superheroes, if you like sci-fi, if you like western, whatever kind of genre you like, there's probably a pretty good comic out there for you. But yeah, that's some of the stuff that right now I'm kind of really liking.
absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for today, Brian. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
It's been
much
an
for
absolute pleasure. Please go and listen to Around the Comics podcast as well, so you can hear plenty more of Brian and his colleagues talking about all these amazing comics. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thank